This is Andrew Jackson. You probably know him as the guy with the crazy hair on the $20 bill. You might even recognize him as America's 7th president. But to a select group of Americans, he's remembered as a genocidal killer. In April 2018, that word, killer, was spray painted onto his tomb in Nashville, Tennessee. It seems odd that anyone would risk a federal felony in order to vandalize the grave of a long-dead politician who left office 180 years ago, until you learn about the grisly atrocities and racist terror enacted against Native Americans by Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump's favorite former president. A big fan of the former president, Trump had Jackson's official portrait hung in the Oval Office and described Jackson as a swashbuckler and a great president who could have prevented the Civil War. The Cherokees had a different nickname for Jackson. They called him Indian Killer. And far from stopping the Civil War, Jackson's actions against America's indigenous tribes led directly to the Civil War, which killed over 500,000 people. During the American War for Independence, almost every native tribe honored their long-standing treaties with the British Crown and fought alongside the King's troops. After the war, many Americans, including Andrew Jackson, hated the Indians for having fought on the, quote, wrong side of the war. Meanwhile, too weakened by the Revolutionary War to battle the Western tribes, official American government policy was one of conciliation. Thomas Jefferson stated that native territory was sovereign and that states should remove settlers who attempted to encroach on tribal lands. That didn't happen. State governments routinely ignored federal treaties and abetted the theft of Indian land through bribery, fraud, coercion, and open warfare. One such series of violent encounters were the Cherokee-American Wars, which brings us back to Andrew Jackson. Jackson thought peace with the Indians was impossible, writing that peace talks are nothing but delusions to put white men off their guard. Treaties answer no other purpose than to open an easy door for Indians to pass through and butcher our citizens. In 1795, shortly after complaining that Indians broke treaties, Jackson led 550 militiamen to break a treaty and attacked and destroyed the Cherokee towns of NICKA and Running Water, butchering hundreds of Cherokee women and children. The slaughter made Jackson a hero in Tennessee, and he was elected to Congress. He served a few years and then resigned to focus on expanding his cotton plantation and slave holdings. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase triggered the westward migration of almost 1 million white settlers. Tribes were pressured to make a choice: assimilate, move, or fight. As this was happening, long simmering political issues between Britain and the United States erupted into the War of 1812. Britain reached out to their old allies in the Muskogee Creek Confederation, but only a small militant faction of about 5% were willing to fight against the United States. Calling themselves the Red Sticks, this group attacked Fort MIMS, Alabama, killing 250 peaceful Creeks, white settlers, and slaves. Andrew Jackson set out with the Tennessee militia to avenge the Fort MIMS massacre. Then, as now, however, there were financial incentives for going to war. The geography of the Creek territory was full of abundant timber, navigable waterways, and fertile swaths of native farmland. Jackson wasn't shy about these ulterior motives either, telling his troops that the country to our south is inviting. The soil, which now lies waste and uncultivated, may be converted into rich harvest fields to supply the wants of millions. Weeks later, Jackson and his men slaughtered 186 Red Sticks, mostly women and children, at Tallahassee. "We shot them down like dogs," bragged American folk hero Davy Crockett. The savagery of Jackson's troops was so intense that in desperation, Muskogee Creek mothers killed their own children before Jackson's soldiers could butcher them. During the next year of the Creek War, Jackson burned peaceful native villages and food supplies, stole an orphaned Creek infant for his wife to raise, and massacred so many natives that his troops had to chop off the noses of the dead in order to keep count of them. When Jackson's volunteer militia began to complain about the hard duty, low pay, and long enlistments, Jackson aimed his artillery at his own troops and threatened to murder any deserters. Finally, Jackson's troops and his Cherokee and Creek allies confronted 1,000 Red Stick warriors in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. During the battle, Cherokee chief Junaluska saved Jackson's life by crushing the head of a Red Stick warrior. After the battle, Jackson told Junaluska, "As long as the sun shines and the grass grows, there shall be friendship between us." Just a decade later, Junaluska would say, "If I had known Jackson would drive us from our homes, I would have killed him that day." Jackson then collectively punished the entire Creek Nation, stripping them of 23 million acres in retaliation for the actions of a tiny minority of the tribe. When the Creek chiefs who had fought at Jackson's side complained, Jackson replied that they were lucky he didn't take all of the Creek Nation's land. Jackson also seized 1.9 million acres of hunting grounds the Creek shared with Jackson's Cherokee allies. Before the ceded territory could be properly surveyed by the federal government, Jackson and his business partners immediately claimed the best land for themselves, further enriching themselves and expanding the amount of plantation land Jackson could force his slaves to grow cotton on. With the Creek War over, Jackson then crushed the British at the Battle of New Orleans, dealing a final blow against British ambitions for America. News of his twin victories propelled Jackson to national celebrity status as a military hero of the Western frontier. From 1815 to 1820, Andrew Jackson served as the Federal Indian Treaty Commissioner. He established a clear pattern. The government would sign a peace treaty with a tribe promising their land would be sovereign for as long as the sun shines and the grass grows. White settlers would then encroach upon tribal land. The tribe would complain to Jackson, who would tell the tribes that this was a state matter and that the federal government had no power to remove the invading settlers. Jackson would then encourage the tribes to move out of their traditional territory, promising them federal security on new lands to the west. Jackson would then restart the cycle by encouraging new invasions by white settlers. During these years, Jackson bullied America's native tribes into surrendering the territories which eventually became the states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Jackson often had a personal financial interest in the lands whose seizure he arranged, quietly becoming one of the richest men in the United States. As Jackson drove Indian farmers off their farms, he replaced them with slaves and cotton plantations, deliberately expanding the number of slaveholding states, leading inexorably to the American Civil War 3 decades later. By 1818, Jackson's work had brought white settlements to the border of Spanish Florida. Here were the villages of the Seminole Nation, a loose amalgam of various native bands and runaway plantation slaves. The Seminoles had integrated and intermarried, incorporating fugitive slaves as free members of their tribe. This angered Southern slave owners who saw this freedom as an inducement for their own slaves to run away. So Jackson encouraged white settlers to deliberately trespass on Seminole lands, and the resulting atrocities became a pretext for the First Seminole War. Jackson took command of the military mission to suppress the Seminoles. President James Monroe ordered Jackson not to attack Seminoles inside Spanish Florida, fearful it would start an international war. Jackson invaded Florida anyway and slaughtered every native he could find. He captured the city of Pensacola, the last bastion of Spanish military strength on the continent. Finally, in 1819, Spain ceded Florida to the United States, and Jackson was appointed the new governor of Florida. Rumors quickly spread that Jackson was again engaging in land speculation on stolen Indian land. Jackson was now seen by many voters as a brilliant military leader who had conquered Britain, Spain, and America's most obstinate native tribes. He was hated by the establishment, political, and business class, but worshipped by the uneducated poor who ignored press criticism of Jackson because they supported his goal of opening Indian land for resettlement by white farmers. In the presidential election of 1824, Jackson won the popular vote but tied in the Electoral College and lost when the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. Furious, he ran again 4 years later and campaigned against what he called a, quote, rotten cabal of rich bankers, Eastern elites, and bought politicians who weren't, quote, real Americans. He campaigned openly on white supremacy, support for slavery, and his record of killing Indians. He won in a landslide, the first Westerner elected president. Upon taking office, Jackson rammed the Indian Removal Act through Congress. Jackson had no interest in making deals, writing that dealing with Indian tribes through treaties was an absurdity, and that the government should simply impose its will on them. Jackson's stance triggered massive opposition among Northern evangelical Christians. Many members of his own party voted against the law. In the end, the Indian Removal Act was decided on a strict North versus South divide and barely squeaked through, only passing 102 to 97 because the 3/5 clause of the Constitution gave extra votes to the slave states who stood to directly gain from Indian removal. Once again, Jackson's pro-slavery, anti-native actions created the circumstances which led directly to the Civil War. Once the Indian Removal Act passed, Jackson immediately got to work. To weaken tribal chiefs, Jackson's administration stopped paying them treaty-guaranteed annuities they used to feed and clothe their tribes. Meanwhile, with Jackson's help and encouragement, southern state governments set about destroying tribal governments, banning tribal assemblies, nullifying tribal laws, imposing taxes, denying natives the right to vote or sue or testify in court. Natives were even forbidden from digging for gold on their own land, a provision passed only after gold was discovered on Cherokee land and thousands of whites invaded, staked out claims, forced Indians to sign leases, killed or beat those who protested, and handed out free liquor to weaken the resistance of everyone else. Once again, Jackson played the federalism card, claiming that the federal government could do nothing to interfere with Georgia's authority. The future for America's tribes was now clear. Indians would not be forced to go west, but if they chose to stay, they would be forced to abide by state laws which destroyed their tribal and personal rights and made them subject to endless harassment and invasion by white settlers coveting their land. If they left, however, Jackson promised land in the west of the Mississippi and financial support. Jackson himself told the Choctaw that they must remove themselves from the states of Mississippi and Alabama and settle on the lands I offer them. There, in possession of land of their own, which they shall possess as long as grass grows or water runs, I will protect them and be their friend and father. This was, of course, not true. The first post-act treaty, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, secured the removal of the Choctaws. To ensure swift signing of the treaty, the government made it illegal for Choctaws to speak out against removal, then bribed 50 tribal leaders with money and western land. All Choctaw land east of the Mississippi was ceded to the United States in return for financial help in leaving, compensation for property left behind, food for the first year in their new homes, and a guarantee that they would never again be required to move. All promises that Jackson's government would break within the year. Instead, Jackson hired private contractors to move the Choctaw westward in hastily arranged migrations in which 1/3 of the Choctaw Nation, 4,000 men, women, and children, died of starvation, exposure to freezing cold weather, and diseases like cholera and dysentery. Next on Jackson's agenda came the Seminoles. A small group of Seminole leaders was coerced into signing a removal treaty in 1833, but the majority of the tribe declared the treaty illegitimate and refused to leave. The resulting struggle was the Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842. As in the First War, fugitive slaves fought beside the Seminoles who had taken them in. Thousands of lives were lost in the war, which cost the Jackson administration approximately $60 million, 10 times the amount it had allotted for Indian removal. In the end, most Seminoles moved west. Starting in 1834, the Muscogee Creek Nation was removed by the military despite never signing a removal treaty. 3,500 out of 30,000 Creeks died of disease and exposure en route to their new territory. The Chickasaws had seen removal as inevitable and had not resisted. They signed a treaty which stated that the federal government would provide them with western land and would protect them until they moved. But once again, the onslaught of white settlers was ignored by the War Department, and it backed down on its promise. The Chickasaws were forced to pay the Choctaws for the right to live on part of their western allotment. No deaths were attributed to their forced march. Finally came the Cherokee, Jackson's faithful allies who had saved his life and helped make him famous. As payment for his life debt, Jackson tricked the Cherokee with an illegitimate treaty. In 1833, a small faction agreed to sign a removal agreement, the Treaty of New Echota. The leaders of this group were not the recognized leaders of the Cherokee Nation, and over 15,000 Cherokees signed a petition in protest and fought removal in federal court. The Supreme Court ignored their demands and ratified the treaty in 1836. The Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily, at the end of which time they would be forcibly removed. By 1838, only 2,000 had migrated, 16,000 remained on their land. The U.S. government sent in 7,000 troops who forced the Cherokees into stockades at bayonet points. They were not allowed time to gather their belongings, and as they left, whites looted their homes. They then began a midwinter march which became known as the Trail of Tears, in which 8,000 Cherokee people died of cold, hunger, and disease on their way to the west. In 1810, 120,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi. By 1844, fewer than 30,000 remained. Only 46,000 lived to make it to the lands which eventually became Oklahoma, lands promised to the natives which would belong to them as long as the sun shines and the grass grows. In reality, those new tribal lands in Oklahoma were also stolen from these same tribes in the early 1900s, a grim repeat of Andrew Jackson's legacy. But today's high school and elementary school textbooks about American history barely mention Jackson's Indian policy. Instead, one finds Jackson the frontiersman, soldier, Democrat, man of the people. Not Jackson the slaveholder, land speculator, executioner of dissident soldiers, exterminator of Indians. It's important that we don't censor history, and we shouldn't wipe terrible men like Jackson from history, but we should understand the man that Donald Trump says had a big heart, and Newsweek says every American owes him a debt of gratitude. Harsh and rough historical facts of the United States historical figures often get glazed over, so it's important to remind everyone the truth of why Andrew Jackson is despised to this day as a killer.